Hi, I'm Andre and welcome back to these English lessons. Now we've been looking at argument and discussion quite closely lately. What we're going to do today is begin specifically to look at discussion. In our next lesson, we are specifically going to look at argument. In order to begin, I'd like to point out to you that probably one of the most important things is to learn to plan your discursive writing. When you plan, you're able to look at the logic you've used and you're able to check that you've widely discussed the issue at hand. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to plan a discussion, ask the right questions of an issue, substantiate your claims, and then introduce and conclude a discussion. Now, when you're faced with a difficult or complicated issue, you really have two options. Either you can state your opinion, or you can begin to learn to write it down effectively. What we're going to try to do in this lesson is learn the techniques which will enable us to write them down. But before we go there, we need to talk very closely about what the difference is between an argument and a discussion. So in order to do this, let's define very carefully to discuss. To discuss is to list many approaches, opinions, many points of view, and draw an overall conclusion. So really, in simple terms, what you're trying to do when you discuss is to look at many varieties of opinion connected to one subject. What you do is put them all together and then hopefully draw some kind of overall conclusion at the end. Now, this is quite similar to the argument. In fact, to argue means almost the same thing, but there are quite clear differences between discussion and argument. So let's define the argument. To argue is to make your own opinion clear and find points which will persuade others that your opinion, that you are right. Right, so we've defined the difference between the argument and the discussion, but we are focusing today on the discussion. Now, the first aspect is the question of choosing a topic. Ideally, you choose something which you know a fair measure about. You're going to select a topic based on your wide knowledge of that topic. Given that there are going to be times when you don't have enough to say about the topic, it is possible, of course, to research, to look up some information, and develop a good discussion. But far more efficient, if you like, is the idea that you choose something which you know about. Let's look at a few topics and try to decide on which are the best to choose. Here's our first example. The currency fluctuation is a result of meddling by speculators on the London and New York stock exchanges. Now, obviously, this kind of issue can only be discussed by a small group of experts. While I'm sure that your English teacher is not really going to give you a topic quite that complicated, be aware that it's not the kind of topic ordinarily you would choose, unless, of course, you're an expert on stock exchanges. Let's look, though, at a second example. Teenagers in South Africa today are able to make more choices about their futures than ever before. Now, this topic, all of you are familiar with. So surely it makes sense that you choose this kind of topic. Think about what you'd be able to say. We all live in South Africa and have some sense of what's going on. We all know about the imbalances of the past in our country. It's likely that most of you are aware of what teenagers are experiencing now. And then older people were once teenagers, so they too will have opinions on the subject. Now think about you're writing an essay or presenting a speech on this kind of topic. Surely you do much better than if you had decided to discuss the New York and London stock exchanges. Your familiarity with the subject matter would certainly improve your writing. So again, I advise you to discuss issues you know something about, especially when you're writing exams or preparing formal speeches or essays at school. In fact, the idea that you're comfortable with the subject matter is going to make your writing noticeably better. Now on to our next step, planning a response. Let's work out how to approach a discussion topic in a sensible way. Let's choose a topic and we'll pretend for the moment that it's X. Now, there are certain questions we must ask ourselves connected to that topic. Here they are. Firstly, what does X mean? Then secondly, what are the various aspects of X? And thirdly, do I agree or disagree with X? Now, the point of asking yourself those questions is to define the topic, then decide what you feel about the topic, and then start to look at options, the areas in which you could discuss that topic. I want us to do this together. Let's go through the process, choose a topic, and actually ask ourselves those questions. Driver's licenses should be issued to people at age 16. The first question we need to ask of our topic is, what does X mean? Well, it seems to imply that given that driver's licenses are issued to people who are 18 at the moment, the suggestion is that we should lower or heighten that age barrier. Then the second question. What are the various aspects of X? What you try to do here is to look at your issue and then think of as many different aspects connected to that issue as possible. You'd look at the arguments for changing the driver's license age and the arguments against changing that age. So two of those points might very well be learner's licenses could be issued at 16, and then against that, someone could argue 16 could be seen as too young an age to be responsible enough to have a driver's license. So what you've done is considered as many of these issues as possible. Certainly the two we've looked at. Driver's licenses could be issued at 16, but our problem is that sometimes 16-year-olds are not responsible enough. Then once you've done that, you've considered as many topics as possible. You go one step further and decide, what do I feel about X? Do I agree with X? Do I disagree with X? To answer this question, you're going to have to think carefully about what you know connected to the issue. And having decided your feelings, you'll need to state a good response. Here's an example of what a good response would be. Anyone trained to drive should be allowed to, but perhaps a 16-year-old is too young to take responsibility for driving. In this response, we've stated quite clearly a claim. We've introduced a premise. Anyone who is responsible should be allowed to drive. Then we went one step further and we substantiated that claim. We said that maybe 16-year-olds are a little too irresponsible sometimes to drive. Now, given that that's how we've begun, do you see that you could build on those 2 points to argue the positives and the negatives connected to this issue? In fact, it might even be a good idea to start your discussion in that way. But then our next step, we need to learn how effectively to conclude a discussion. Now, effectively to conclude a discussion, you need to do the following. Firstly, you must check that you have discussed in enough depth. So think of all the thoughts, all the theories which could go towards arguing this issue. Then you must also check your logic. Is the progression right? Have you substantiated enough? If you haven't, it might be necessary to change one or two phrasings. And then finally, when you conclude, you must conclude in a reasonable and well-balanced way. Here's an example of how we would conclude the issue which we raised earlier. 16-year-olds should know right from wrong. If trained, they'd be able to drive well. It follows that driver's licenses should be issued at age 16. Do you see that this would work as the ultimate conclusion of your discussion, whether it were a verbal one or a written one? Let's try to summarize what we've done thus far in this lesson. We looked at choosing your topic, planning your response, questions which would help you introduce your topic, and then concluding your discussion. The one thing which we haven't looked at is what happens between this introduction and the conclusion. So let's call again our topic X and start looking at questions we can ask to fill up the space between the introduction and the conclusion. We may want to ask, what are the causes of X? What are the consequences of X? Can X be compared to other issues? What's the importance of X? How do I respond to X? And then, what are my feelings about X? So if you answer those questions, you're going to develop other points, other issues, which will go towards building the body of your essay. They'll also develop your speech away from the introduction and towards the conclusion. Right, now here's the task for today. In a newspaper of your choice, find an editorial. That's going to be the article written by the newspaper's editor. Then, read that editorial closely and highlight conjunctions, argumentative or discursive vocabulary, and the editor's opinion. That really takes us to the end of our lesson on discussion. Remember that in the next lesson, we're going to be looking closely at argument. I hope you're with me that time. Goodbye.